Okay, hello and good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here and joining us, and welcome to the latest installment of our British Institute for Libyan and Northern African Studies lecture series. Now, a very quick reminder, just before we get started, if you have any questions for our speaker, please type them into the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we will go through them at the end of the lecture. So today we are really pleased to have with us Dr. Kristian Göransson. Kristian is senior lecturer in classical archaeology and ancient history at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. His research interests focus on the Greeks in Cyrenaica and Sicily, but also on ancient pottery, in particular transport amphorae. For several years, he was part of the Society for Libyan Studies Euesperides project, and he wrote his doctoral thesis at Lund University on the amphorae from that site. He was director of the Swedish Institute of Classical Studies in Rome between 2013 and 2019, and before that, the curator of Greece and Rome at the Museum of Mediterranean and Near Eastern Antiquities in Stockholm. He is currently now working on a monograph on the ancient Greeks in Cyrenaica, and today he is going to tell us about the Greeks and Libyans in ancient Cyrenaica, cooperation and conflict. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture. And I'll get started. It's a particular pleasure, of course, to speak to the Bilnas Institute and to be able to talk about Libya. That's a privilege. And well, Cyrenaica, as many of you will know, we'll start with the geographical setting here. I thought corresponds to the eastern part of modern Libya, and the name, though used by Roman authors such as Pliny, is anachronistic for the period studied here, but used for conventional and practical reasons. To the Greeks, the region was known as Libya, or simply Cyrene or Cyrenea, the land belonging to the city of Cyrene. Now, the Libyan coastline is largely an inhospitable desert, with the exception of Cyrenaica. Here, between the Gulf of Sirte and the Gulf of Bomba, there are several bays and anchorages, as well as sources of fresh water. And most of the coastal plain is relatively narrow, only a few kilometers at the most. Further inland, I'll show you a picture here, the land masses rises into escarpments of about 300 and 200 meters respectively, creating high plateaus. And then it rises even further to over 800 meters above sea level. And when you reach that sort of height or these escarpments, you really are in the Jebel al-Akhtar, the green mountain, which indeed is very green, being heavily forested and cut through by wadis with seasonal streams. And the land then declines to the south, to the south, as farmland is replaced by an arid steppe, and finally the desert. So Cyrenaica can thus be divided into 4 zones: the shrubland of the coastal plain, a subhumid steppe where grain can be grown, an arid steppe, and then the desert. And this is also in line with how in antiquity both Strabo and Pliny characterized the different zones of Cyrenaica, noting the well-watered plateaus of the Jebel, which is where the Greeks settled. And as regards the desert, this was a far greater obstacle in antiquity than in more modern periods in history. The camel was not common in Egypt until the Ptolemaic period, or in Libya until the second half of the 4th century AD. This means that for most of the time considered in this lecture, the desert was a boundary, although caravan routes through the desert did exist. And from a Greek point of view, and I show you this map again, Cyrenaica was approachable by the sea, not by land, and this has led scholars to the observation that Cyrenaica essentially is an island, sundered from Africa by deserts, which really were more impassable than the sea. And in order to reach Cyrenaica from the closest part of the Greek world, one could benefit from the prevailing northerly or northwesterly winds in the summer, which make for a short journey sailing from Crete or the Peloponnese. So these parts of the Greek world down here. In the 4th century BC, Periplus of Pseudoskylax, this story of circumnavigation of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The journey from Lacedaemon to Phalasarna on western Crete is said to be 1 day, and the journey from there to Libya is a day and a night. On the other hand, Strabo informs us that the sailing time from Cyrenaica to Phalasarna is 2 days and 2 nights, which sounds reasonable given that the voyage northwards was against the prevailing wind. Now, about the arrival of the Greeks, I'll try to give a brief overview of the colonization of Cyrene. Herodotus is our main source for the foundation of Cyrene, and for this we are lucky to have more details than for any other Greek colonial foundation. This is not the place to go into all the details of his account, but a brief overview is necessary. And the foundation of Cyrene is traditionally dated to 631 BC, and the description by Herodotus begins in the mythical past with the foundation of Thera by Theras the Lacedaemonian, and then relates how Batos from Thera, that is Santorini, was instructed by the oracle of Apollo at Delphi to go to Libya and establish a settlement there. Now, Herodotus writes 2 centuries after the events he describes, and his sources are the local traditions he heard and read when he, as is very likely, visited Cyrene. He gives different versions of the foundation, but essentially the stories agree on the main points. Batos did not obey the oracle, since he and his fellow Therans didn't know where this place Libya was located. As a consequence, Thera was struck by severe drought for several years, after which the Therans returned to Delphi, where they were reminded of the prophecy by the oracle to found a settlement in Libya. So after a reconnaissance voyage with the help of a Cretan fisherman, they organized a full-scale expedition to North Africa. Both Herodotus and the inscription known as the Agreement of the Founders, which is dated to the 4th century BC, state that men were forcibly conscripted for this expedition based on family and not on political division, which tells us that there was no civil war at Thera behind the foundation of Cyrene. The Therans settled on a small island called Platea. This is a map where it gives with question marks, which is justifiable, the location of Platea, possible location of Platea, and then close to this Gulf of the mainland in the Gulf of Bomba. This was not in accordance with the will of the oracle, so they moved across the water to the Libyan mainland and founded a settlement at a place called Theris, which you can see my arrow here, again question mark somewhere there. And the point really is that they moved from the island to the mainland, and in doing so they had done what the oracle of Apollo at Delphi had told them to do. They were, however, not completely happy with this location either, so they were guided by Libyan tribesmen up to a plateau on the Green Mountain. And this is where the Libyans first entered the story, as told by Herodotus. And at this new location, they found a suitable place to live. And the Libyans told them, "Here, ye Greeks, it befits you to dwell, for here is a hole in the sky," as the translation goes by godly from Herodotus. And with this, they meant that the place was well watered due to the abundant rainfall. And this is where Cyrene was built, and to this day, Cyrenaica, as many of you know, remains well watered with an average rainfall between 400 and 600 millimeters per year. And the landscape around Cyrene is conspicuously green and fertile, as this picture I took some 20 years ago now shows us. And it's important to remind ourselves also of this difference in height, because as the crow flies, it's 10 kilometers from the coast up to Cyrene, but it's at an altitude of about 600 meters. And presumably the Greeks had explored the area quite extensively while they were residing at Asieris, before deciding to leave the coast and move up on the Green Mountain. It's not clear if the Libyans actually helped the Greeks move to another location, or if this was a result of conflict between the two groups. Nonetheless, it's interesting that the Libyans are mentioned here as guides who helped the Greeks, but also as being clever, since Herodotus writes that they led the Greeks past the best land in darkness, so they would not see it. The Greeks did not completely abandon the coast. Cyrene needed a port. As I said, Cyrenaica was approached from the sea, and they really did need a port. And that lay in modern-day Susa, a bit further to the west. And later this port became a city in its own right, named Apollonia after, well, the god Apollo, obviously, testifying to the importance of Apollo to the Cyrenians. And just a few more slides here to set the scene, as it were. Overlooking the sanctuary of Apollo, and some views from Apollonia, and that palm tree is no longer with us. Yes, overlooking the site of Apollonia. Now, another important source for the history of Cyrene is Pindar, from whose pen we have no less than 3 odes honoring Cyrenian victors in the Pythic Games at Delphi. And in Pythian 9, he recounts the myth of the nymph Cyrene. She was taken to Libya by Apollo. It was she who killed the lion that ravaged the flocks of the native king Eurypylus. And the prize Eurypylus set for whoever managed to kill the lion was his own kingdom. Pindar calls the land the choicest garden of Zeus. And this episode can be seen as a mythical creation of Cyrene, of the land around Cyrene, foreshadowing the actual, let's say, political foundation by Battus. And here I think it's worth reminding ourselves of just how remote Libya was. This was really on the edge of the Greek world. And as Irad Malkin has observed, Libya was a new continent for Greek colonization, and the protection extended to the Greeks by Zeus, as he says, must have been of paramount importance. And of course, they built a fantastic temple to Zeus, as you can see here. Now, after having ruled for 40 years, Battus, the founder and first king, died. His tomb, in a prominent position at the Agora, became a place of veneration. Then followed 7 more kings, and they were named Battus and Archesilaus, one after the other. During the reign of Battus II, we're now in the first half of the 6th century BC, the Delphic oracle encouraged people from all over the Greek world to settle in Libya with the Cyrenians. But this led to problems with the Libyans. Herodotus writes, and I quote, "So a great multitude gathered together at Cyrene and cut off great tracts of land from the territory of the neighboring Libyans." End of quote. The Libyans, they turned to Egypt for help, but the Egyptians were then subsequently defeated by the Cyrenians at a place called Irasa. The next king along was Archesilaus II, nicknamed the Harsh. And in the middle of the 6th century BC, Barke, or Barca, here, modern El Marj, was founded around 100 kilometers to the west of Cyrene. It was founded by brothers of Archesilaus II, and according to Herodotus, the reason for this breakaway foundation was a conflict between the king and his brothers. These brothers also encouraged the Libyans to revolt against the king, resulting in the death of 7,000 Cyrenians, a number that really strains credibility, and in the end, also the assassination of the king himself. What is particularly interesting with this story, I think, is how the Cyrenians used the Libyans in their own infighting. Presumably, exploiting decades of Libyan resentment with the rulers of Cyrene. As regards the other Greek cities in Cyrenaica, which you can see here on the map, we have Tavgera or Tokra and Euesperides, modern Berenike here in the west. Little is known from the historical sources, but archaeological excavations give us valuable information. Excavations at Tokra, undertaken by the Department of Antiquities of Libya and the British School at Athens in the 1960s, demonstrated that the Greeks were there or at around 620 BC. And here you see some of the pottery published by Boardman and Hayes in the very valuable publication of the Tokra excavations. Just a few examples. As regards Euesperides, it's not known when or how the westernmost of the Greek cities in Cyrenaica was founded, but the earliest fine pottery from the 1999 to 2007 excavations by the Society for Libyan Studies and the Department of Antiquities of Libya date to around or just before 600 BC. And this is then followed by more pottery datable to the first half of the 6th century, which would indicate that Euesperides was founded and settled within a generation or two after Cyrene. Now, the question is, of course, was Euesperides founded by Cyrene as a sub-colony? Here I think it's important to keep in mind that the prophecy by the Delphic oracle, which both Pindar and Herodotus cite, gave Battus all of Libya to settle, not just Cyrene. Despite having excellent relations with Delphi, Cyrene never asked for a foundation oracle for the other cities in Libya. So technically all the settlements belong to Cyrene. This makes the colonial situation in in Cyrenaica very different from that of Greek colonies in places like Sicily, Magna Graecia in South Italy, or the Black Sea. Cyrenaica was not colonized from numerous mother cities. Now, one can of course wonder if it's realistic to believe that Cyrene had the resources and enough people to settle and keep control of both Tokra and Euesperides within the generation of the foundation of Cyrene itself. The early settlements at Tokra and Euesperides may have been very small footholds, really, and while the pottery dates back to the late 7th century and early 6th century BC, we lack information about the nature and size of the settlements. In any case, the oracle is clear, and there are no other foundation oracles for colonies in Libya. When all Greeks, as the prophecy had it, were invited to settle in the early 6th century, such a large number of people came that the Cyrenians sought help from Delphi to organize their society. This happened after Archelaus II had been murdered and when his young son Battus III had become king. Delphi told them to bring a peacemaker from Mantinea in Arcadia, and when the Cyrenians inquired about this, the Mantineans sent certain Demonax. And the solution he came up with was to divide the population into 3 tribes. And you see in this slide here the division of them, of the people into these tribes. So it was Therans and the so-called Perioikoi, the people living around, which is something one could discuss what that actually means. And it was the Cretans and the Peloponnesians. And the third was all the islanders. The Perioikoi could refer to the Libyans, but it has also been suggested that these Perioikoi are later arrivals from Thera. However, as we saw in the excavations at both Cyrene and Tokra, early pottery from the islands has been found, so there were definitely contacts with, for example, Rhodes early on, and it's not unlikely that various islanders came and settled in Libya before the arrival of the many Greeks that prompted this division into 3 tribes in the 6th century. And as we have seen, tradition says that Cyrene was a Theran foundation and that only later did others come. But as Irad Malkin convincingly has argued these others may have been there from the beginning, but they were not important to the foundation narrative. And Cyrenaica's relative stability with Egypt did not last very long, for in 525 the Persians conquered Egypt. And Archelaus III submitted to Cambyses in order to avoid an invasion. But then trouble in the ruling family and among the nobility at Cyrene increased. And after Archelaus III had been murdered by his enemies at Barca, the forces of Ariandus, the Persian satrap of Egypt, marched into Cyrenaica in 515 BC. They captured Barca and after a siege and reached as far west as Euesperides. Around 440 BC, the eighth and last king of Cyrene, Archelaus IV, was murdered at Euesperides. Then followed an aristocratic and subsequently a democratic government in Cyrene. And thus ended the Batiad dynasty, which Herodotus tells us was only to last for 8 generations, according to the Delphic oracle. Now, if we turn to the Libyans, what do we actually know about the Libyans now? We have only really just touched upon them. But if we take a closer look at the information we have about them in the sources, well, as with everything else related to the early history of Cyrene, what we know comes primarily from Herodotus. He gives a detailed ethnographic account of the various Libyan tribes, and the tribes are named, and as might be expected, he is quite detailed on their strange habits, highlighting the exotic. Still, from this description of the tribes, we learn where they live from east to west in relation to the Greek settlements. So, for example, on this map, you have some of them marked out. If we look to the east here, we have the Gilligamai, and they live in the land near where the Greeks first arrived when they came to the island of Plataea. Then we have the Asbistai, who are residing what he describes as above Cyrene, which is inland to the south of the city. And then there is the Auskisai or Auskises here. They live inland from around Barca down to Euesperides on the coast. And then we have small tribe of Bacales who live near the Auskisai and down to the sea at Tokra. And finally, the large tribe of the Nasamones in the west. And they inhabit a large area, both coastal and inland, and that probably really corresponds to the land south and southwest of Euesperides. And then he describes more tribes living beyond the land of the Nasamones, such as the Garamantes or the Makai. That brings us beyond the area of Greek settlement. Herodotus also, interestingly, I would say, gives a Libyan origin to 3 Greek customs. He says that Athena's aegis, which can be seen wearing in this statue from Athens, is said to come from the hairless tasseled goatskins worn by Libyan women. And the Ololuge, ceremonial chant by women at sacrifices, comes from Libyan women. And he says that it was the Libyans who taught the Greeks to drive 4-horse chariots. Even if the accuracy of this information can be questioned, the mere fact that at least some attributed these customs to Libyans is interesting, indicating that the colonial cultural encounters worked both ways and was not just a question of Greeks Hellenizing the Libyans. And besides Herodotus, we have another important source who tells us valuable information about the Libyans, and that is Diodorus, who says that there are 4 Libyan tribes. He mentions the Nasamones in the south, the Auskisai in the west, the Marmaridae occupying what he describes as the narrow strip between Egypt and Cyrene, and then the Makai in the region of the Greater Syrtis. So he doesn't go into the sort of fine detail that Herodotus does, but some of these tribes most of these tribes are also mentioned by Herodotus. Interestingly, also, Diodorus divides the Libyans into 3 categories depending on how they live. So he classifies them as sedentary farmers, pastoral nomads, and the real desert dwellers who wear goat skins and live from pillaging. This seems like a systematic and reasonable division of the Libyans, and also an important acknowledgement of the fact that the Libyans were not a collective, but rather a name for a very heterogenic group of different peoples. Diodorus then proceeds to give a long and detailed description of the tribes, especially the large tribes of pillagers in the south. Now, from the Libyan tribes themselves, we have no written record, and archaeologically very little is known about them. Somehow they managed to live side by side with the Greeks, although their lifestyle was quite different, or perhaps because their lifestyle was quite different. Those who were nomads or semi-nomads did not immediately compete with the Greeks for land, but the sedentary farmers did. And regarding the adoption of Greek customs, the sources also give us some information. Herodotus says that the Asbistae tribe live inland of Cyrene, and they do not come down to the coast because that is Cyrenian territory. He also tells us that they drive 4-horse chariots to a greater extent than any other Libyans. And he says it is their practice to imitate most of the Cyrenian customs. Another source, Pomponius Mela, the 1st century AD geographer, writes that most of Cyrenaica is populated by peoples who have adopted Greco-Roman habits, except for a few who take pride in speaking the language and revering the gods of their forefathers. So it seems that at least these tribes who were closest to the Greek settlements were heavily influenced by Greek cultures. By Greek culture, whereas those who lived further afield were not. And in a study of the historical interrelationship of agrarian and pastoral livelihoods in Cyrenaica, the geographer Douglas L. Johnson states that a self-sufficient mixed pastoral agricultural lifestyle represents a successful cultural adaptation as it gives access to the full range of resources of the Jebel al-Akhdar. And you can see a quote from him here where he says, farmers and herders have coexisted in Cyrenaica because the natural environment offers possibilities for the development of each. This coexistence frequently has been a strained and violent one, for to a considerable extent, both groups are in competition for access to land and water. The relative balance of power between the two livelihood modes is exemplified by the repetitive advance and retreat of the frontier of agricultural settlement. And Johnson also notes that Berber reliance on agriculture would have been greater in antiquity than today, because before the arrival of the Greeks, the option of obtaining products necessary to the nomadic way of life from a sedentary urban population was non-existent. Now, if we look at contacts and interaction between the Greeks and the Libyans, current research on ancient Greek colonization in general, if we look at Greeks in a colonial setting, as it were, has really greatly benefited from the work by Irad Malkin, and not least his acclaimed study of networks in the Archaic Mediterranean. Book you can see here, A Small Greek World from 2011. And Malkin's use of middle ground as a more suitable term in historical scholarship than, say, contact zones or creolization or hybridity is interesting, and I would say particularly useful in studying the Greek settlement in an area such as Cyrenaica, where there was constant contact and conflict between the Greeks and the Libyans, but also with other peoples like Egyptians and Phoenicians. So the middle ground becomes the interface between the Greeks and the other cultures they encountered and lived next to, the space where they interacted with each other. We can imagine such interfaces when it comes to religion and commerce. To give some examples, an example from the sphere of religion is the god Zeus Ammon, whom the Cyrenians came to regard as their national god. The Libyan tribe the Nasamones, literally meaning men of Ammon, worshipped Ammon, and as Malkin has pointed out, the cult probably served as a medium of communication with the Libyan tribes. And you can see on this slide here a coin from Cyrene depicting the head of Zeus Ammon with a ram's horn here, and of course also the very important oracle of Ammon in the Siwa oasis a bit further to the east. So if this was the case, that they actually met and worship together in some way, this would be a good example of a middle ground, increasing the chances of Greeks and Libyans living together peacefully. Herodotus, when it comes to religion, says that the Libyans sacrificed only to two gods, the sun and the moon. But we can look at another important cult at Cyrene, and that is the extramural sanctuary of Demeter and Persephone. The excavator of this site, Donald White, suggests that Libyans participated in the rites performed there. He makes an interesting observation about the mention in Herodotus that Libyan women venerate Isis and will not eat cow's flesh because this is forbidden among her Egyptian followers. And he says, and I quote, "The native Libyans saw in Isis enough in common with their own religious beliefs to adopt the dietary restrictions of the Egyptian cult," end of quote. And then White goes on to argue that, quote, "From the Isaic syncretism, it was a small step for the native element to yield to at least a marginal acceptance of the Greek cult," end of quote, being the Greek cult of Demeter. And he says that the cultural fusion between Greeks and Libyans was brought about in the religious sphere, mainly through intermarriage. And similarities between Egyptian, Greek, and Libyan beliefs fostered what he says could be a limited syncretism between the unnamed Chthonian fertility deity and Isis, followed by a similar merging with Demeter Persephone. And here you have these very, let's say, still enigmatic, faceless or veiled funerary sculptures from Cyrene, of which so much has been written, and which really is a topic of a lecture in its own right. But I would say that I think I find this an attractive suggestion, and I would agree with Gerald Schaus, who has also said that the Libyans probably were included for important roles in the life of Cyrene. And if we look for an interface regarding trade and economy, a good example is Silphium. Can't talk about Cyrene and the Greeks without mentioning Silphium. Herodotus notes that this much sought after plant grew from Plataea in the east to the mouth of the Gulf of Syrtis in the west, probably on the lower escarpments of the Jebel al-Akhtar. Attempts to cultivate Silphium had failed, and it gradually became rarer until it really became extinct in the early Roman imperial period. And Silphium seems to have been grown on the pre-desert steppe, probably in the area near Euesperides, where it may have been gathered by the Nasamones. They and other Libyan tribes must have known where it grew, and we can imagine them picking the plant and trading it with the Greeks in the cities. Herodotus says that the Silphium trade was a royal prerogative of the Abbasid kings, but it's not known how this was enforced. It's at least important enough to be on the coins of Cyrene for hundreds of years. We do not know anything about the nature of this exchange between the Libyans and the Greeks, if this is how it happened. Perhaps there were elements of forced labor in this trade, where Libyans had to provide Silphium to the Greeks as a form of tribute. Another example from Euesperides is purple dye production, which was an important component in the economy of the city. The excavations indicate purple dye being produced on a large scale in what best can be described as an industrial activity involving a high degree of specialized labor. This activity must also have included the territory of Euesperides, with substantial interaction with the semi-nomadic pastoralist Libyans, who, we may assume, supplied the city with the wool used for the production of purple dyed and other textiles. So these are examples of the two groups meeting each other, but living side by side in separate communities. So what about living together, actually living together? Was there even such a thing? André Laronde, in his study of rural sites in the Cyrenaican countryside, notes the problem for archaeologists to distinguish specifically Libyan elements amongst the ancient remains. He believes that the sites described in his inventory were most likely inhabited by what he calls a mixed population, partly Greek-speaking, partly Libyan. And he asks, how could a line be drawn between Greek colonists, Hellenized Libyans, and Libyans who had kept their own language? And he also underlines that the antagonism was more between sedentary and nomadic populations than between Greeks and non-Greeks. The southern nomadic tribes were just as much the adversaries of the northern Libyan tribes as they were of the Greeks in the cities. And if we look at a slightly later period than the theme of this lecture, which really, where I try to keep myself to the Archaic and Classical periods. So if we look at the early Hellenistic period, oh, sorry, I should have shown this before. This is the Arcesilas cup depicting Archesilas II of Cyrene, probably, overseeing the weighing of silphium, a fantastic Laconian calyx from Vulci, now in the collections in Paris here, as you can see. Anyway, yes, this is the source I was referring to here from the early Hellenistic period, the so-called Diagramma of Ptolemy, where he says that, well, it's about citizenship in Cyrene, and he says that those who are born of Libyan mothers, and this is an interesting mention. Then he gives the sort of geographical location between these two places, but the point really is that this shows that intermarriage between Greeks and Libyans did occur, and at least in the Hellenistic period. And we shall return to this interesting and slightly contested matter very soon. So besides the episodes mentioned above, we also hear of a not so successful attempt at establishing a colony in Libya. Herodotus tells us that the Spartan Darius, who had expected to become king, refused to become a subject of the new king, his half-brother Cleomenes. In anger, he set off with a group of Spartans to Libya without consulting the Delphic oracle. And with the help of some men from Thera as guides, he settled by the Knips River, described as being in the fairest part of Libya. And this place is actually located near Lepsis here in the west, in Tripolitania. And this event, it took place 515 or 514 BC. In the third year, he was driven out by the Maccai tribe, which we already heard about, together with the Carthaginians. The point of this whole story is really to show that a colony not sanctioned by Delphi will not last. So this was going too far, and Cyrenaica was really the only land granted to the Greeks by the gods. Then, in an episode from the Peloponnesian War, we hear of a Spartan fleet commanded by Gylippus in 414 BC that had to seek shelter in the port of Euesperides due to bad weather. There they helped the Euesperitans defeat the Nasamones, who had laid siege on the city. So clearly life in the westernmost of the cities was pretty exposed to hostility from some of the Libyan tribes, and Euesperides was repeatedly attacked. But we should nuance this picture and keep in mind that the Libyan tribes were very heterogeneous, and as indeed the sources tell us. And as regards Libyan names, they have been found in inscriptions from Barker, from Tokra, and Ptolemais, and from Cyrene, of course. There is an intriguing story told by Herodotus about a certain Alasir. He's described as king of the Barcians, and his daughter was married to Archesilas III. It was precisely in Barcae that Archesilas III was killed by his enemies when he had sought refuge there with Alasir, his father-in-law. Alasir's name is Libyan, and he may have been a Greek Libyan, perhaps. And since Barcae, the breakaway settlement, you remember, founded by the brothers of Archesilas II, the city, because it was this breakaway settlement, the city may to a large extent have been a Greek Libyan settlement because the Libyans helped the brothers revolt against the king. But one should also bear in mind with the La Ronde that not everyone with a Libyan name is necessarily a Libyan, nor does a Greek name imply a purely Greek origin of its bearer. And we can think here, for example, of the story of the Spartan king Lysander, whose brother was named Libyas, excellently studied by Malkin in an article. Still, it seems reasonable to think of Cyrenaica as consisting of large groups of people who in varying degrees were both Greek and Libyan, as we would define these concepts. How they saw themselves is another matter, and one that is hard to get at, since this may have manifested itself in activities of which we have no trace. And here I believe with Gabriel Zuchtriegel that it is important to look at how Greekness and ingenuity were used as forms of social distinction within local communities, as he writes. And he bases his study on examples from places like Massalia, Chersonesus, and Poseidonia Paestum to underline how people used names, customs, and styles which had different ethnic connotations as a means of marking out social and not ethnic differences within these communities. Regarding the language, was there a Libyan influence on the Cyrenaican dialect of Greek? Well, Catherine Dauviat-Lalou has pondered this question in a recent article, and she says that the Libyan language mentioned by Herodotus is really the dialect of Cyrenaica and not the language of the Libyan tribes. And her conclusion is that few words in the Cyrenaican dialect are of foreign origin. The traditional view of mixed marriages between Greek colonizing men and native women has been challenged by Malkin. His discussion includes both Pindar and Callimachus. In the Hymn to Apollo, Callimachus describes how in the first celebration of the Carneia festival to Apollo, the Greek colonists take Libyan women as partners. This is dismissed by Malkin as late foundation lore, as he says, that cannot be given too much credence. And Malkin sums it up, or this was an earlier quote, I should have told you. Anyway, yes, I did tell you, but I didn't show you the slide. So when it comes to this hymn to Apollo, Malkin says, and I quote, whereas Cyrene presents the best case for intermarriage in the literary evidence, it is obscure, sometimes mythological, it does not point to the first two generations of foundation, and actually shows that the distinction between Greeks and Libyans was kept alive even in the Hellenistic era. Greek women had to be present early on to carry out important religious rites, and I think this is very important to keep in mind. This was knowledge that was passed down from mother to daughter. If Greeks only had intermarried, each Greek colony would have developed along very different lines, affecting dialects, religion, and other traditions, so that we would not have had this small Greek world. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we study Greek colonization and interaction between Greeks and non-Greeks. So to wrap this up, I would argue that although the Greeks and Libyans lived together, married each other, and were dependent on each other, for the Greek cities in Cyrenaica in the Archaic and Classical periods, there can be no doubt that they felt closer in a cultural sense to other Greek cities in the Greek world than to their Libyan neighbors. The notion of being Greek in the island that Cyrenaica in effect constituted must have been felt very strongly and been reinforced on a daily basis as they encountered non-Greeks. they were very keen on participating in the Panhellenic Games, as attested not only by the 3 famous Pythian odes by Pindar, but also by victory lists from Olympia, where the Greeks from Cyrene and Cyrenaica occur. Furthermore, the Cyrenians had a treasury at Olympia, and from the 4th century BC also one at Delphi, underlining the strong connection the city had with Delphi and again with the Panhellenic shrines. Through maritime trade, they were in constant contact with other Greeks across the seas, and in times of famine, Cyrenaica's rich harvests came to the assistance of cities throughout the Greek world. Still, I would say that it is evident that the colonial situation in which they found themselves taught them how to live together with the friendlier sedentary or semi-nomadic Libyan tribes. One can perhaps think here of a situation somewhat similar to the medieval convivencia under the Umayyads in Al-Andalus in Spain. In any case, despite many conflicts, some kind of peaceful coexistence developed between the Greeks and Libyans in Cyrenaica. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really very interesting. I think this is just a really fascinating topic about how, about how Greeks and Libyans were sort of interacting and living together at the time. And I really liked this sort of idea that you mentioned about the sort of middle ground and using that as kind of the approach to this topic. So we do have one question already that someone has raised. And so we have a question from Fadiel Fadel, who asks, where are the borders between Cyrenaica and Tripolitania during the Greek period, during the periods you're talking about?
Yes, well, I mean, yeah, the borders were set out between the Greeks and the Carthaginians, really. And I mean, traditionally, there is this thought of the altar of the Philaeni brothers. Perhaps we can go back a few slides here. Here, the Arae Philaenorum on this map. See my arrow here. Mm-hmm. That is at least traditionally or mythologically perhaps described as the border. I mean, yeah, it's one thing that our work at Euesperides demonstrated was that the Greeks and the Carthaginians, or the Punic people in Tripolitania, they really traded a lot with each other. They had a lot of contact with each other. So, but of course, they had their area of, let's say, economic interest, and so I would say I think we can pretty much trust this as a border, but there aren't really traces of very much Greek presence going on south or southwest of Euesperides.
Great, yeah, that's helpful clarification there. Okay, so our next question we have from Catherine Dobialalu. She says, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I would add that our information about marriage is one-sided. No Libyan man marrying a Greek woman is mentioned. Just see if you'd like to comment on this.
yes, thank you. That's a good and a fair point. Thank you.
Next, we have another question from Wojciech Mazur. Thank you for a fabulous talk. Could you tell us a bit about how the faceless statues are interpreted? Are they funerary, and do they come from a particular time period?
Yeah, this is, go back to the slide here. This is, in a way, I'd rather not go into this because it's pretty complicated. And actually, it has been studied recently by Belsic in was this 2020, and also Susan Kane has studied this in the late 90s, and yeah, I mean they are enigmatic, and they come from the tombs. So well, sometimes they're interpreted as being this local Libyan goddess of death, of funerary cult of some sort, and I guess that is perhaps the best we can do. I refer to the work by Susan Kane and Belsic really, because you need a lot of detail, the time to go into the complexity of the interpretation, but they are fascinating.
Yes, yeah, they are so interesting and enigmatic, aren't they? These very, very strange sculptures. Our next question, we have another question from Fadel, who asks, what is Kerak city nowadays? He says that they're from Bin Jawad town next to Ras Lanuf.
Okay.
Yes, I think on the slide before,
There we go. Yes,
west of Ras Lanuf. Yes. What is there now? I think they're asking.
Well, my honest answer is I don't know. I wouldn't dare to answer that. Sorry, can't say.
Fair enough. I actually have a question for you. I was just wondering, so you sort of mentioned that, obviously the kind of archaeological evidence for interaction between Greeks and Libyans is a little bit more lacking, if I've understood correctly. But this is probably a little bit of a difficult question, but how would we go about finding more of that kind of evidence? How would you approach perhaps what sort of things could we look for, really?
Or in interaction?
Yeah, in terms of well, for example, between Libyan and Greek intermarriage. Sorry, that's a difficult question. Perhaps just ideally, what would you be looking for?
Well, it is difficult also because the fact that, as Laurent pointed out, the Libyan name doesn't necessarily mean Libyan origin, and of course the Greek culture being the dominant culture in at least in the cities, the general idea, of course, is that the Greeks women who married into the Libyan women who married into Greek families were just sort of taken up and gradually perhaps lost their Libyan identity, and it's certainly not visible in the archaeological record, which is also in itself interesting, given if you compare with other colonial situations. If you look at tombs, for instance, in South Italy and Sicily, where you see a lot of Stickle or other Messapian or other local, let's call them indigenous peoples, the material culture of those very present in the grave goods, and sometimes it's purely, let's say, local, and sometimes it's mixed, and then it sort of gradually becomes Greek. You don't have that really in Cyrenaica. We lack so much material evidence from the Libyans, who obviously we know were there, but yeah.
Yeah, indeed, it's really interesting that lack, exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay, yeah, a few more questions have popped up now. So from Salam Mayar, thank you for the insightful presentation. One Libyan intellectual claimed that the settlers from Thera were Libyans in origin, and it was simply a return of immigrants. Have you ever come across this concept? Is it compatible? Is it or is it contemptible?
Yes. I read about that. Yeah. That it goes back to the Minoan period, and that they are the ancestors. Yeah, exactly. The Libyans shown on the Minoan frescoes are actually the ancestors of Battus, who then sort of comes back and returns to Libya. Yes, that's an intriguing thought. But yeah, no, yes, I have come across it. I'm not sure what to make of it, but yeah.
Next question from Ahmed Bouzayan. He sends his greetings. Many thanks for this interesting lecture. Perhaps we have a very good example of Libyan tribes who lived isolated from the Greeks. They resided in Slancha, just south of Cyrene. They have their own cult that is completely different from the Greeks.
Yes, hello Ahmed. Thank you. That's a very good point. I didn't bring up Shlanta in this lecture because, at least as far as I know, it's a lot later proposed dating of the sanctuary at Fronta than my period. But yes, yeah, that's a very important site.
Oh, and just a comment from Salem to add that the book that he referred to is in Arabic and is entitled Cyrene, the Other Face by Dawood Halag.
Oh, okay, thank you very much.
Irad Malkin has just added a comment as well to say Xenia relations may be responsible for some Libyan names, compare Tersenos and Thessalos, etc.
Yes, thank you very much, Irad.
Next question from Graham Barker. Are any estimates possible between the relative scales of Greek and Libyan populations at this time?
Yes, very good question. I'm not sure how we would go about finding out, actually. The Libyans are so invisible, to me at least. I really can't see them as clearly as I would like to. I wish in a way that we were able to, that we had more, let's say, carefully excavated tombs. I think that could perhaps give us a lot of information. The fact that the necropolis Cyrene are so, let's say, plundered ages ago, and now they're being destroyed as we speak. So it's so many lost opportunities, and one could only hope for untouched cemeteries to be excavated in a careful manner. Perhaps that could give us some indication.
Yeah, indeed, that would be wonderful. Andrew Hill says also thank you for a fantastic presentation. He asks, on one slide, a quote was mentioned about a back and forth advancing and retracting of borders of land under agricultural cultivation. Is there any evidence, for example, archaeologically for this occurring?
Well, not really. I know that in the study by André Laronde, when he really did a very careful study of the territory of Cyrene, he could see old field boundaries. But of course, what you see is the latest border lines, let's say, and it's hard to say how these may have shifted or did shift over time. I think that in itself was quite remarkable, that he was able to see how the land had been divided up, and then sort of these boundaries had not been touched since antiquity, really, because they were just stones lying there. And so I think it would be difficult, but I think it's more. I mean, Johnson, who I refer to there, he studied the Green Mountain over a long period, but of course focusing on the more modern period, so the 19th and 20th centuries. But I think that kind of lifestyle, as he argues, is what it is, you know, and it what we see in more modern times can be applied to antiquity as well, to a large extent at least. So I guess it's a hypothesis, but and it seems reasonable that it has shifted over time, and that the agricultural land has been sort of taken over by pastoralists, and then there is a push in the other direction depending on who's stronger. But it also shows that there has to be some kind of balance between these two modes of living, because they also to some extent depend on each other. And you just have to think about the manure. Imagine all these thousands of sheep going over the lands, and you know, that really is fantastic fertilizer for the fields. So there is really a very fruitful convivencia, as I used of a historical term, but living together in some kind of mutual coexistence, which was beneficial to both parties.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question, Francois Chevrolier says, thank you for this very interesting presentation. When you talked about Malkin's book, A Small Greek World, you mentioned the relationship between Cyrenaica and ancient Phoenicia, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us more about those relations between Phoenicia and Cyrenaica?
Yes, I mean, when I said the Phoenicians, I depends on what you want to call them. I really, in this case, mean the people living in the West, which we would also call the Punics. So it's the Phoenician cities over here in Atleptis and Sabratha and this area with whom they were in contact. So my point was really to say that there was, at least when it comes to trade, there was a middle ground between the Greeks and the Phoenicians, Punics as well. But of course, they weren't really living together, so they met at places where they could trade. And the archaeological evidence for this, again, as I said, from Euesperides, is quite overwhelming and to some degree perhaps surprising how much Punic stuff actually came to Cyrenaica.
Great. Next question. Philip Sharp also thanks you for a really interesting talk. He says, I was living in Libya, in Benghazi and the Jebel area, and spent a great deal of time in the Greek cities. I always thought the faceless representations was that of Persephone. It was a long-lived tradition, but is there any truth in this? So back to our...
yeah, again, yes, that's one of the ideas, and it could very well be. So yes, possibly, and that would be perhaps again, I mean, it's closely related with the mortuary rituals and the funerals, so and the underworld, I suppose. So yeah.
Just another comment from Fadel Fadel, just mentioning that the copper statue of the two brothers of Philanorum is still in the museum next to Sirte City.
Yeah, I haven't been there myself, actually. It's one of those places I never really sort of made it to, but I would love to see those. I know that they're Italian, but still, I would love to see them at some point.
Yes. Okay, a couple more questions we have here. Tarek Elamam says, thank you for the presentation. I'm curious, do we have any evidence of where the majority of the city's population went after its fall?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
I'm not completely sure what city they're referring to.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind is that the people who lived in Cyrene, they just stayed on. I mean, the city came under different rulers, and then it became Roman, and then it's there was never an exchange of peoples throughout antiquity. I mean, yeah. So in that case, in that sense, it didn't really fall. It certainly didn't fall during the time I'm studying.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so one final question, I think, from Dania Ben. They say, you mentioned that the Libyans were invisible to you. Is the reason that there is a lack of Libyan sources mainly because of limited opportunities to excavate sites, or are there any other reasons?
Yeah, mainly the former, I would say. There hasn't really been opportunities. I mean, you could argue that perhaps also there was a time when this wasn't really interesting, and of course, a lot of the archaeology undertaken in Libya was conducted in the Italian colonial period, and of course, they were focusing on the Greek and Roman, especially the Roman presence in Libya, justifying thereby the return, as it were, of the Italians. But then again, you really would want to, as I said, you would want to find cemeteries, and because they didn't seem to, I mean, even though some were sedentary, we haven't really found any sort of Libyan villages, and the nomads we have no traces of. So I guess the high on the wish list would be tombs with unlooted tombs, where we could have some more information about the material culture, if indeed this would be manifested in the grave goods. We don't even know that, so we know so very little.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I think we should wrap up there. Thank you, everyone, for your very interesting questions and the interesting discussion that this has prompted. Now, before we wrap up completely, I would just like to mention that our next event will be on Tuesday, the 13th of May online, and this will be a roundtable to celebrate the recent publication of one of Billness's new edited volumes, Tripolitania in the Roman Empire and Beyond, which you can purchase or download on our website, open access, which was edited by Niccolò Mugnai. We were going to have 3 of the authors of the edited volume, Sergio Aiosa, Florian Schimmer, and Isabella Welsby-Sjöström, to give us short papers, followed by a discussion about the themes of the volume and the future of Tripolitanian studies. Please do sign up for this event. You can find out details and register on our website, billness.org. Look out for emails and follow us on social media for updates. And it only remains for me now to thank Kristian for a really interesting talk. We're really very thankful that you were able to join us today and give us this very interesting lecture. So thank you, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just close the meeting. All right, goodbye.